Do you believe in fate or do you believe in free will? Where do you stand in this age-old question? Were you always fated to watch this video? Do you have predispositions that if someone else could see, they could determine what your opinion would be? Do you have the freedom to choose right now? If you change your opinion, is that something that was always fated anyways? The modern reframing of this question is that of determinism or indeterminism. And this modern reframe attempts to contain the question a bit, and it certainly does, but ultimately both framings are still pointing at the same deeper inquiry, an inquiry at the heart of so many of our other questions. So let's try to explore this question today, fate or free will? And let's see why, perhaps, it's the setup of both questions that lead us to endlessly ask the question in the first place, that supposed binary. So maybe, just maybe, determinism is a high-level emergent property of foundational and fundamental indeterminism, a statistical illusion of sorts. And what even is your will? What is your fate? What does that even mean? Well, maybe they're not that distinct after all, because to be truly free is to be aligned with your nature, because it's to not have anything that you're trying to free yourself from anymore. And paradoxically, of course, if you want to change your fate, you have to accept it first. Welcome to Philosophy of Everything. I'm Susan Reese, and thanks for being here. So let's start by taking a look at some of the high-level classifications or categories in terms of how to think through these questions. So on one side of the argument and conversation, we have the determinists and the fatalists. These are distinct ideas. You can be one and the other or one and not the other, but nonetheless, they're certainly still on the same side of the argument. So the determinists say that everything is caused and predicted. So the way to think about determinism is to imagine a row of dominoes stacked up. And as each domino falls over, it knocks the next one down, and so on. So there's a sense of causal order. There's a sense of clear data, of clear patterns. And thus, you can make clear predictions of what's going to happen and when. You can say, this domino is going to fall down, and it's going to fall down after this one does, etc. That is determinism. So the fatalists are taking a more broad perspective to the same question. So they're saying that the future is fixed. Now, I believe so many people wildly misunderstand this idea. But ultimately, what it means is if you were to make a change even in your life, all of that is still part of your fate. Now let's look at the other side of the argument and conversation. So on this side, we have the indeterminists and the libertarian free willers, if you will. So the indeterminists just take the opposing idea to determinism. So they say not everything is caused and predictable, and there are indeed some actions, some events and experiences that are spontaneous, that are random, and that cannot be clearly predicted with certainty. The libertarian free willers, similar to the fatalists, are taking a more broad scope in how they look at this, and they're saying that the source of your will, the source of your actions, is that of your own, and thus you indeed have libertarian free will. Now, the last category or classification I want to bring in here are the compatibilists. The compatibilists sit somewhere in the middle. So they say that we do indeed live in a deterministic world. So in that sense, they're on the side of determinism. But they also say that we need the ideas of free will and indeterminism to live better. So from a perspective of human psychology, we do have free will, and we need this from a moral perspective to live a life of meaning, etc. So you can see that they're kind of taking a bit of both sides. In my opinion, compatibilists are holding a contradiction, not a paradox, and that's an important distinction. But nonetheless, let's start by looking at determinism and indeterminism a bit more. And we're just going to start there because, as I said in the beginning, that's a more contained question. But eventually, as we go through, the lid's going to pop off anyways, and we'll get into more peculiarities of fate or free will. So, the determinists, as I mentioned, it's that row of dominoes, remember? Causality and predictability. So do they have any science that they can lean on to ground their perspective or to lean on for their argument? Well, yes, we'll see that the determinists actually have an awful lot going for them. So to start, Newtonian physics directly supports the idea of determinism. And this is classical mechanics. So as long as we have all the data, and we do have all the data, we can make clear predictions, and our predictions are certain. So there are certainties here. This leads to determinism. Now, let's immediately contrast that to indeterminism. So whereas the determinists can point to classical mechanics, the indeterminists can point to quantum mechanics. So the most high-level, explicit distinction between classical and quantum mechanics is that the former allows for certainties, for certain predictions, because there is this causality, etc. Whereas the latter, quantum systems, do not. The best you can get are probabilities, not certainties. Now, quantum systems, they have spontaneity, randomness, superpositions, uncertainties, etc. So it leads to this idea or perspective of indeterminism. So interesting, we can already see that they both have a physical grounding, but from different perspectives. Now let's take a look at the neuroscience. Is there neuroscience that supports either side? Well, yes. Let's start with the determinist. So at a high level, in the 1980s, there was an experiment by Benjamin Libet. He studied the brain's activities before, during, and after an act of will. So I'm calling it an act of will. What he studied was just human movement, but act of will because we're acting on an impulse. So his study revealed that the brain shows activity, what he called quote-unquote readiness potential, in advance of our conscious awareness of the intent to move. So to say otherwise, the brain is already unconsciously acting on the impulse before we're consciously even aware of our intent to have the action at all. So this was a significant study, and it's really led to the idea that free will is an illusion, largely because it shows that we're not the source of our quote-unquote will at the conscious level. So consciously, we think that we're making a decision. We have the intent to act, the intent to move. But its source is something we can't explain, or rather its source is something before our conscious awareness. So again, free will is an illusion, at least in the physical realm, or at least from their perspective. Now, let's contrast that to the indeterminists. Does that mean they're out of luck when it comes to neuroscience? Well, no, and they can actually point to the same experiment and subsequent experiments that studied that quote-unquote readiness potential more. So remember that readiness potential is the brain's activity before the conscious awareness and conscious intent. So in subsequent studies, it was found that this readiness potential is actually random neural fluctuations. So instead of it being very concrete impulses of do this, do that, we can see it's actually a lot more random. So yes, the source of quote-unquote will is not at the conscious level, but whatever is happening unconsciously in the brain is not something that can be easily determined because it's random. There's spontaneity here. There's a sense of uncertainty, so hence determinism. Now, you could also say or argue from this perspective that even if, again, that source is at the unconscious level, at the readiness potential level, we can still override it, or we can still change it once it comes into our conscious awareness. Now, I'd argue we can, but most of us aren't, and that will come back later, so just hold on to that for now. But now let's take a look at the genetics. So is there any genetics that supports either side? And again, yes. Let's start with the determinists. We'll see that the determinists have an awful lot of genetics to point to for their argument. And I'll give you just one high-level understanding of this. So our DNA is something we are only recently even beginning to understand, at least in my opinion. But we do know that genetics, our DNA, reveal a lot more about us beyond just our physical characteristics. So on the spectrum of wildly unethical twin studies, there was a more ethical twin study from the 1970s called the Minnesota Twin Study. And I believe it went into the 80s as well, potentially even longer. And this study looked at identical twins that were raised in different environments. So said otherwise, same nature, different nurture. And so did it reveal that they had the same fate, the same fixed outcomes? Well, the study revealed that 50 to 70% of our traits were determined by genetic factors. So traits like our IQ, intelligence, temperament, psychological behaviors, and even peculiar things like political orientation could all be determined by our genetic factors, 50 to 70%. Now, if you've seen that famous documentary, Three Identical Strangers, that was from another study. That study was so unethical that the findings are not released. It's sealed for another 30 or so years. But just reading the articles about it or watching that documentary, you can also anecdotally say something very similar. You can say that clearly nature has an awful lot of impact. In that study, the three identical triplets were raised in very distinct environments. So even distinct socioeconomic environments, and yet they still had a lot of the same experiences. Interestingly, even similar things that happened to them in their lives, or the brand of cigarette that they smoked, their mannerisms, their mental health struggles, they all had an awful lot in common, which can lead you to believe that nature has a lot more say. And thus, you could say determinism, because if then we can look at those genetics, we can determine with certainty how you're going to be. So now indeterminism. Does that mean they're out of luck for genetics? No. Enter epigenetics and neuroplasticity. So these are two distinct phenomenons, and neuroplasticity is more neuroscience than genetics, but I'm putting them together here because they speak to the same phenomenon. And this is the phenomenon of nurture impacting nature. So in epigenetics, it's a change of gene expression. And in neuroplasticity, it's a change in brain rewiring. In both scenarios, again, it's about this idea of nurture changing nature. So with different environments, with different experiences, and importantly, with conscious attention, we can change. Now, importantly, your DNA is not changing. That's not what epigenetics is about. You don't suddenly have a different hair color one day. I'm not going to wake up blonde because I exposed myself to a lot of blondes. What epigenetics means is that your same DNA, so the DNA stays exactly the same, the chromosomes stay exactly the same, but they can be expressed differently. So certain genes that are otherwise suppressed can now be expressed, or other genes that were expressed can now be suppressed, or some kind of different pattern between them. That's what epigenetics is. And similarly, neuroplasticity is not you suddenly having a different brain, but it's about building different connections in the brain that reveal different patterns, or rather they manifest as different patterns psychologically. Now, if you saw my Many Parts of Self episode, I ranted about how our sense of self is really just a series of patterns, a series of parts that make up a pattern, a living pattern. So this is important because this speaks to what neuroplasticity is really doing. So neuroplasticity allows us to change psychological patterns, to change our sense of self, again, with experience, with environment, and with conscious attention. Okay, so let's peel this back now. So we can see that both determinism and indeterminism have evidence to support the argument. We certainly went through that very quickly and very high level, but nonetheless, they both have evidence to support their sides. So what is really going on here? Well, now let's take a look at the layers of conscious awareness. So let's go back to that readiness potential and the experiment by Benjamin Libet from the 1980s. So often, the determinists can point to either this experiment or readiness potential more broadly to say that free will is an illusion. Free will is just something we rationalize cognitively and consciously after the fact. But because there's brain activity in advance of our conscious awareness and conscious intent of it, our real agency is not ours. We don't have the ability to actually choose. There's something that's going on before that. Well, this idea takes a very significant stance on who you are without even acknowledging that they are. So they're saying that you are the conscious mind only, and that the unconscious mind, the brain activity, the readiness potential is not who you are. Because if that was also who you are, then you still have free will. So according to this idea, you are just the iceberg and not the ocean. And that is a pretty radical thing to say. But let's keep exploring this more. So what is that unconscious? So we can say that this is the unconscious because the readiness potential, this brain activity we're referring to, is happening before it reaches the conscious awareness of our conscious intent. So the unconscious is something that has been spoken about for the ages in different terminology, but is now something that cognitive science proves. Not only does it prove the unconscious, we know that the unconscious is actually constantly operating. And not only that, but most of our behaviors, our preferences, and our emotions are happening at layers beneath our conscious awareness and distributed brain systems. So most of our experience, so our emotions, our behaviors, as well as most of our impulses and desires, our behaviors and our preferences are happening at the level of the unconscious, not the conscious mind. Now, that unconscious, the unconscious mind or the unconscious field, it's nonlinear. Now, it is eternity, but let's just stick with nonlinear for now. We'll ease into it. So let's take a look at implicit versus explicit memory. So explicit memory is stored in the hippocampus, and this is the type of memory that we can consciously recall, and we can recall it with facts. We can say when it happened, we can say what happened. It's conscious recall, it's factual, it's very cognitive, this explicit memory. Implicit memory, however, is not something that can be consciously recalled. It is the memory that is stored in our bodies and in our amygdala, as opposed to the hippocampus. And it's also the memory that speaks to most of our traumatic experiences, because it gets stored without a timestamp. So our nervous system is functioning as if this moment of time from the past is happening now, without us even being consciously aware of it. So we are reacting or we are responding as if we are in that same situation or that same moment of time from the past. But we're not. We're in the present. And this is what unconsciously drives our responses from the threat detection and our body. So again, most of where our unconscious impulses are coming from in the first place. The unconscious mind is non-linear. So let's play with a couple metaphors now, because it sounds like the unconscious is that of a quantum system. It's non-linear, it's random, it's spontaneous, it promotes the ideas of indeterminism because there's not certainties here. And the conscious mind is an awful lot like classical mechanics. It's causal, it's linear, it's predictable. There's a sense of determinism there. Well, let's take a look at the statistical illusions of scale. So there's a paradox here, and I love a paradox, that as systems grow, so as they have more data, they become more complex, they actually become more predictable. So at an individual or localized level, there's fluctuations. But as they come together in larger and larger groups or larger scales, they can now average out, and there's now a sense of predictability. So interestingly, there's a sense of coherence to more chaos. Now, an example of this, to put this in context, is look at financial markets. If you were to try to predict price trends for individual companies or 500 individual companies, you would probably do a terrible job. Now, if you were to put all of these 500 companies together and say make the S&P 500 index, you can now look at a chunk of data. You can look at patterns. You can find trends, and you can now make clear predictions. This is that statistical illusion born of scale I'm speaking to. And this is what's happening as things emerge out of the unconscious and to the conscious. So out of the ocean and into the iceberg sticking above the ocean. So what are you, though, exactly? So according to the determinists who use that specific example I gave you, they're saying, well, you're just the conscious mind. How can we touch on the question of fate or free will if we don't understand who is asking the question, and we don't understand what will is, and what does it mean for that will to be free or not? Free from what? Or free from whom? To help us explore these questions further, let me introduce some of the perspectives from F.A. Hayek. He was a behavioral economist from the 1950s. He had a lot of ideas on the brain, and without even using the term unconsciousness, that were dismissed at the time. But he was ahead of his time because neuroscience is now proving a lot of his theories. So I personally love a rogue thinker who is utilizing their free will, so let's take a look at some of his ideas. He talked about the brain essentially being a spontaneous order, so similar to markets, where complex order is emerging, but without any central direction. So back to that financial markets example. No one is secretly in control of everything, setting all of the prices, or even setting the price of the index. It is self-organizing, and this is how he described the brain. The brain is a self-organizing classification system that creates, you could say, maps of that unconscious, constant sensory input. So the behavior arises from distributed brain activity at an unconscious level, not from a central commander. Conscious thought is just the tip of a vast, unconscious neural process that classifies and predicts patterns. So Hayek's view of the brain indicates that what we experience as conscious choice is just the surface of that vast, unconscious classification process. So what we experience as determinism, as causal linear time that can be more easily predicted, is actually just the surface of a vast, unconscious, unpredictable, indeterministic process. So who are you then? If this self-organizing understanding speaks to the idea that there is no central commander, who is the you that is potentially free or not? So now let's go to psychosynthesis and Roberto Assagioli. So psychosynthesis is, in my opinion, what modern psychology should be, but that's a rant for another day. Nonetheless, in psychosynthesis, the will is a central component of human psychology. And the I and the self are distinct terms. The I is just pure awareness. It is the witnessing center of consciousness. So in the sentence, I am this or that, the this or that is the experience. The this or that is the quality that emerges from the experience. It is that of causal linear time, that of the conscious mind, and it is of a deterministic worldview. However, just the I am, it's not the I am anything, just the I am is just the pure awareness. It is just the I. And this is that of an indeterministic, eternal, nonlinear, quantum, unpredictable, random, spontaneous, superposition field. So what is the will then? Well, the will is the force that is able to self-organize into harmony so you can act intentionally. So just like financial markets, they're self-organizing, there's no central commander, but you could perhaps look at it and think there's a central commander because there's a sense of coherence to it. Not coherence in the sense that the markets are perfect, but in the sense that they are self-organizing. So through collective behavior of otherwise independent agents that on their own, localized, individualized, would be random, spontaneous, indetermined, but together, collectively, form an organizational system that is predictable and determined. No single entity controls the financial markets. Its behavior self-organizes through feedback loops, information flow, and adaptive responses to external conditions, just like you. This is what your will is. Your will is that force that's able to do that. And it's from the I, or it's expressed through the I, the ability to be the witnessing center of consciousness, as opposed to being the attributes or the experience or quality that again is of the conscious mind. The will is a networked process of conscious focused attention, emotional regulation, and future planning, so some kind of ideals and goals. And these come together as a force, a self-organizing force, to put together what would otherwise be random and constant data, sensory input, information, and allow us to make decisions, to act intentionally or not on our will. So who we are is actually just our will. Our soul or our psyche, remember that those are the same word, is just our will. There is no single self, there's no central commander, but there is a self-organizing force, just like in that financial markets example, and just like the way that Hayek described how the brain works. The self-organizing force is the will. It is your will to be. Ancient traditions from around the world spoke to this. In the Upanishads, it says, quote, "You are what your deep driving desire is. As is your desire, so is your will. As is your will, so is your deed. As is your deed, so is your destiny," unquote. You, at the source, are nothing other than just desires, impulses. And other traditions speak to this as well. So in Christian mysticism, the whole goal is to align your will with God's will. The Sufis speak to exactly the same, aligning your will with the divine will. The Taoists speak to the same, but using different terminology, aligning yourself with the Tao, with the flow of nature itself. Well, we can reframe this now as aligning the unconscious with the conscious, aligning the ocean with the iceberg, There's a famous quote from Carl Jung, quote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you will call it fate," unquote. So our unconscious, again, is just all of these impulses, all of these desires from all of this constant sensory input, data, etc. And if we are not consciously aware of this, then we are going to be acting, we're going to be making decisions from a place that's not intentional. So importantly, although Carl Jung speaks to making the unconscious conscious, there are feedback loops between them. They're dipping back and forth between the two at all times. Now, paradoxically, it's actually the physical world, the world of determinism, that is of linear causal time that can be easily predicted, that actually gives us a sense of psychological control. This is because we can easily predict what's going to happen next. And it's actually that level of being uncertain, of not knowing what is going to come next. So the unconscious, or that of a quantum indeterministic field that allows us to emerge something new in the first place. So, to be truly free, or to have true free will, is to align your fate, your nature, who you truly are, with your will, with your conscious acts. To be free is simply to let go. Because you're not free if you're endlessly trying to chase something outside of you to feel like you're free or to feel like you have free will. If you think you need to accomplish something, you need to be successful in certain ways in life externally in order to feel like you have free will, you will never be free. You are always chasing after something else. Those chains may be invisible, but they are motherfucking heavy. To be free is to let go. And again, paradoxically, it's actually only then, it's only when you do let go, when you don't know what's coming next, that allows you to be in the space of the unknowing in which something new can emerge in the first place, and in which you can now make conscious change. So let's talk about epigenetics and neuroplasticity a bit more. I mentioned these in the beginning. So again, they are distinct processes, but they point to a similar phenomenon. And if you recall, in the beginning, I mentioned 3 scenarios in which these can occur: environment, experience, and conscious attention. Now, I want to focus on the third one, conscious attention, because the first 2 are happening at all times. So both epigenetics and neuroplasticity are happening at all times without us being consciously aware of it. So we can imagine it's not always a good thing. We develop maladaptive coping mechanisms all the time, for example. We develop new behaviors and new patterns that we do not want all the time. So it's not necessarily aligned with our intentions, and that's what we really want. So we're going to focus on that third one, conscious attention. What does that mean? Well, again, remember how I described the will and the 3 network processes that come together to define how we can force this self-organization. That is conscious focused attention, future planning, and emotional regulation. So our will to be is what allows us to engage consciously with neuroplasticity and epigenetics. So let's look at neuroplasticity specifically. So mindfulness, another idea that has been known through the ages and now science proves. So we now know that mindfulness and mindful practices, or you could just say presence, help our brain build synaptic plasticity, help us grow new neurons, and even help with emotional and learning flexibility. So by practicing mindfulness, or by being mindful, we can engage consciously with neuroplasticity. We can build new neural connections in our brain. The qualities of mindfulness, at least summarized for these purposes, include 1, acceptance. Acceptance is the present moment. You have to accept your circumstances, or the world, or the thought pattern, the behavioral pattern, the experience from the past, etc. You have to accept it. You have to see it for exactly what it is. That's what it means to be present with it. And only then can you change it. So you don't accept it so it can stay. You accept it so it can be transformed. 2, compassion. And 3, pro-social behavior. So both 2 and 3 are connected actually to pro-social behavior. So for example, the ventral vagal nerve is connected to social engagement. It's what primes us to be social and to connect with others. And this is directly connected to priming for neuroplastic change and mindful behavior. And 4, conscious attention. So focused attention, mindful attention. And what's interesting is, if you recall, that's actually one of the ways I described will, the force that self-organizes. So again, your will is creating your fate, and your fate is your will. They are one and the same. You are engaging back and forth between feedback loops between the unconscious and the conscious. And how you experience that is up to you and your exercise of your will via your ability to have conscious attention, emotional regulation, and future goals, ideals, future planning, etc. So you can make decisions and act in intention. The alignment of the personal will with the transpersonal will. The seed of a tree has all of the intelligence, all of the wisdom to grow the full tree before the tree is ever born. And this works for you and me just the same. All of the wisdom for all of our lives, all of our behavior is already in our seed. But this is just in the physical realm, in which there is that causal linear time and thus determinism. At metaphysical perspectives, there is no linear time. So there is no future to predict. There's just who you are, but your experience of becoming, which is your existence, is up to you and your free will. So I believe in both fate and free will, and to me there is no inconsistency, because your fate is that of your will. It's just a matter of, is your will your conscious will or your unconscious will, and are they aligned? When we have profound experiences in life, moments that feel like they are fated, and those are so meaningful, well, I actually believe those are memories of impulses, of desires that emerged but were never completed. And that leads us to the ideas of the larger cosmic order in which we are all rounding out. But that is a conversation for another day. Thank you so much. Take care, and I'll see you next time.
Where do you come from? Another galaxy.